Hi, this is Jeff Mann, and I'm going to be producing another video presentation. This is episode 4 on the topic of why professional golfers who use a bowed lead wrist technique have to supinate the lead forearm more during the later downswing. Now, I did episode 3 where I talked about the motorcycle move, and there were two types of motorcycle moves I described. The true motorcycle move, which I've described as being not useful and not practical in a real life golf swing. And then I described a second variation which Tyler Farrell uses, which I stated combined a bowed lead wrist technique with an element of a twist away maneuver. Now, Tyler Farrell, when he describes this technique, this variation of the motorcycle move, he believes that it closes the club face relative to the club head arc in the early downswing, and he believes if you do that and you close the club face by an extra 20 to 30 degrees, that it would allow you to just rotate into impact and not have to use any or as much lead forearm supination. And I believe that he's totally wrong. I believe if you use that technique as he described it, you actually have to use more lead forearm supination. And in this episode number 4, I'm going to describe why I believe that phenomenon exists. So here I am, I'm sharing an image of Jon Rahm, who's a classical example of a golfer who uses the bowed lead wrist technique. So here in image 1, he's at his end backswing position. Image 2 is at P5. Here in image 3 is at P5.5. And here in image 4 he's at P6. If you look at Jon Rahm at the end backswing position, you can see he already has a bowed lead wrist. But if you look at his club face and follow my pointer, the club face is still roughly parallel to the back of his lead hand. It doesn't seem to be closing. As he starts downswing and he gets to P5, he actually is less bowed than he was at the start of P4 position. And if you look at the club face again, it looks parallel to the back of his slightly bowed lead wrist. Now, what happens as he goes from P5 to P5.5, you can see there's a dramatic change happening. If you look at the club face now, it looks like it's rolling counterclockwise. So it's becoming more closed. And by the time he gets to P6, it's even more closed. And the question is, what is he doing to close the club face between P5 and P6? And if you look, you can see a number of features. The one is his degree of lead wrist bowing is increasing by P5.5. If you look at his radial bone here, you can see as he bows his lead wrist, his radial bone is rotating counterclockwise. And what's not so easy to see in this image is that he's probably applying a degree of what I call a twist away. So as he bows his lead wrist here, he's probably clenching his 3rd, 4th, and 5th lead hand fingers more, and that would cause the club face to close. And when he gets to P6, you can see it's tilted somewhat towards the ground. And if you had to compare that to Scotty Scheffler, who who also uses a weak lead hand grip, but who doesn't use the bowed lead wrist technique, his club face would be angled back slightly at his P6 position, and John Rahm's club face is closed by another 20 to 30 degrees. So this is exactly what I think Tyler Farrell is essentially doing. He's doing a bowed lead wrist maneuver, and that you can see angles the club shaft slightly back and under the plane, combined with a certain degree of twist away. Now the question is, will this mean that you need to use lead forearm supination in the letter downswing, seeing that you've closed the club face by an additional 20 to 30 degrees by using the bowed lead wrist technique combined with a small degree of twist away? So I'm going to go to the next image, and we're going to analyze what happens in John Rahm's P6 to P7 time period. So here is John Rahm at P6, here P6.5, P6.7, image 3, and then at impact. You'll notice John Rahm places his ball very far forward. In fact, it's just in front of his lead foot. So when he comes into impact, his club shaft is tilted in that direction. He doesn't have forward shaft lean. Now, if you look at image 6 and you look at his club face there, it looks like it's tilted towards the ground, which is compatible with the idea that he used a club face close-in maneuver, which is equivalent to the motorcycle move that Tyler Farrell uses. But what's interesting now, you can see he's got a bowed lead wrist here, bowed lead wrist over there, and he comes into impact with a bowed lead wrist, and he's maintaining essentially roughly the same degree of bowing as his lead wrist. But start to look at the club face relative to the back of his lead hand. As I mentioned, if you use the bowed lead wrist technique combined with an element of twist away, the club face will be closed relative to the back of your lead hand. And you can see at this point, it's almost disappeared already. The club face is roughly in line with the back of his lead hand, and certainly over here, it's in line with the back of his lead hand. And the club face closing phenomenon due to the twist away action has disappeared. And I believe the reason why it disappeared is that as the club starts to release, and the club is now traveling at a very fast speed. In John Rahm's situation, I would not be surprised that in this area it's traveling 100 miles an hour to 120 miles an hour when using a driver. The releasing club is exerting a tremendous amount of centrifugal outward pull, which will stretch the flexor muscles to his third and fourth fingers that allowed him to perform the twist away maneuver. So that's why the twist away element of this technique disappears. So what he's left with is essentially a bowed lead wrist coming into impact. Now what happens when you have a bowed lead wrist? So look at this image here, image 2 at P6.5. Notice when you have a bowed lead wrist, that angles your club shaft well back, away from the target. And that would account for the fact that his club face is open relative to the ball target line and relative to his club head arc. And you can see that as he comes towards impact, because he maintains a bowed lead wrist all the way into impact, he will always have a marked degree of angulation of the club shaft backwards away from the target, creating an inordinate degree of forward shaft lean. Now, if he came into impact with this amount of forward shaft lean, like you see here at P6.7, he essentially would have too much forward shaft lean, more than he would desire. So what he has to do in the late downswing, starting actually at P6.5 and becoming more manifest at P6.7 and then at impact, is he's actually supinating his lead forearm by a large amount. And to see that, I'm going to go to the next image. So I'm now sharing an image which is a close-up image of what John Rahm is doing in his late downswing. This image one is P6.5, here it's at P6.7, and there he is at impact. The yellow line I've drawn over his lead lower forearm's radial bone, if you follow it, you can see how much it's rotating counterclockwise between P6.5 and impact. When he comes to impact, you can see it's rotated far more than you would expect for someone who uses a weak lead hand grip. And if you can either look at the watch face area of his lead lower forearm, or you could look at the logo on the glove, and you can see he's supinating his lead forearm by a large degree in order to close his club face. And as I said, why does he need to do it? And the answer is basically, if you have a bowed lead wrist technique and you maintain the bowing all the way into impact, that angles the club shaft backwards away from the target, creating a large degree of forward shaft lean. And if you have a large degree of forward shaft lean, then the club face relative to the ball target line is open. So for him to close the club face by impact, to get it square to the target, and to get the amount that he desires of forward shaft lean at impact, he actually has to supinate his lead forearm more than the amount you would expect for a golfer who uses a weak lead hand grip. I'm now going to go to another image, and this is Colin Morikawa that I'm going to be discussing. So Colin Morikawa uses a bowed lead wrist technique, just like John Rahm. And here he is at P6.5. Sorry, that's about P6.2. Here, image 2 is P6.5. Here he's probably at P6.8 in image 3. And then at impact, you can see that he has a small degree of forward shaft lean at impact, in contrast to John Rahm, because he places his ball further back in his stance. Now, if you look at his club face at P6.3, relative to the back of his lead hand, it looks slightly closed. And that could be because, as I said, if you use the bowed lead wrist technique combined with an element of twist-away maneuver in the early mid-downswing, it would cause the club face to be slightly closed relative to the back of your lead hand. But you can see that by the time he gets to P6.5, it doesn't look closed anymore relative to the back of his lead hand, and certainly not here or there. So the club face closing phenomenon has dissipated. It's essentially worn off. Now, because it's worn off, the only factor that's in play now is the fact that he has so much bowing of his lead wrist. It angles the club shaft backwards, away from the target. And then you can see here in image 2, his club face is open relative to his club head arc. And you can see that he has to close it by impact. So if you look at the club face, it's closing more. And the way he's doing it is by supinating his lead forearm. So I've drawn a green line over his lead lower forearm's radial bone. And you can see at P6.5 it's angled there. At P6.8 it's almost facing the camera. And at impact it's rotated more. So the point I'm making is if you use this technique, the bowed lead wrist technique, using a weak or neutral lead hand grip, you actually have to supinate your lead forearm more in order to close the club face by impact, because you have so much angle lean back of the club relative to your hands that you have to rotate it more so that you don't come into impact with too much forward shaft lean. So if you look at him here, let's say at P6.8, you can see he has a lot of forward shaft lean. And that's more than he would desire at impact. He only wants this amount, as you can see. So, and you can see to close the face and to get his desired amount of forward shaft lean, he has to continuously supinate his lead lower forearm. And that's a characteristic feature of golfers who use the bowed lead wrist technique. Now, as I mentioned, if you looked at this image 1, I said that it looks slightly closed there. And that suggests relative that he was using a twist away maneuver. So if you didn't use a twist away maneuver between P4 and P6, as you start to increasingly bow your lead wrist, then the club face wouldn't be that closed. And then in the late downswing, as I said, you still have to use a lot of lead forearm supination to square the club face by impact, because bowing of the lead wrist angles the club back away from the target, which relative to the ball target line means that the club face here in P6.5 is open relative to the ball target line. Now I'm going to go to the next image. And this is an image of Tyler Farrell performing his golf swing action, and I captured it. So if you look at this particular golf swing action, I'm not saying it represents his normal golf swing action. I want you to notice here he is at P6 in image 2. And if you look at his back of his lead wrist, it almost looks slightly cupped. It doesn't look bowed, which suggests to me that in this particular golf swing action, he was not using his motorcycle move action. If you look at his club face here, you can see it's still open, and then he squares it by impact. Now notice where his radial bone is pointing at impact. I'm using my pointer to show the angle, and you can see it's angled a lot to the right. And the reason why is if you look at him at address, which is image 1, he adopts a moderately strong lead hand grip at address, where his radial bone here is rotated to the right. And when he comes in to impact, you can see it's in the identical degree of angulation. So the amount of supination you need in your late downswing if you use a moderately strong lead hand grip is going to be less than a golfer who uses a weak lead hand grip. So you can see he comes into impact there with a small degree of forward shaft lean, and you can see where his radial bone is situated. Now I'm going to go to another image. And this is an image of Tyler Farrell demonstrating the motorcycle move. So this is an image where he starts off his lead wrist, looks at the P5 position slightly cupped, and then in his early downswing, and he performs the motorcycle move, he starts to bow his lead wrist, so by the time he gets to this position it's bowed, and then when he comes into impact you'll see it's bowed like that. Now the interesting thing is, if you look at his radial bone here, you can see it's rotated more counterclockwise in this particular swing action that he's demonstrating. And the reason is that when you use the bowed lead wrist technique, you have to supinate more to square the club face, because you have a lot of angulation of the club shaft relative to your lead forearm. So if in this particular instance he was using an element of twist away, it would disappear by impact, right? Because, as I said, when you're swinging at a golf club at full speed, the centrifugal outward pull of the club will stretch your finger flexor muscles in your lead hand and eliminate its ability to twist the club shaft using a twist away maneuver. So when you come into impact, you'll notice that his club face is in line with the back of his lead hand. So he doesn't have any twist away maneuver, but he does have a lot of backward angulation of the club shaft due to adopting the bowed lead wrist technique. And therefore, to get a square club face at impact, he had to use a slightly greater degree of lead forearm supination. Now, if you look at the amount, I'm pointing now at his radial bone, it's nowhere as much as John Rahm or Colin Morikawa. And the reason is that he doesn't bow his lead wrist in his personal golf swing as much as the other two golfers. So therefore, he's not going to need to supinate his lead forearm as much as John Rahm and Colin Morikawa. What I'm going to do now to emphasize everything that I've said, I'm going to stop sharing these images, and then I'm going to go back and turn on my camera and do some personal demonstrations. So I'm going to move my chair out of the way. So let's consider what I was talking about. Let's say this is a weak lead hand grip. Club face is more or less in line with the back of my lead hand, watch face area of my forearm, and the radial bone. So if you're at this position here, and you do what people do who use the bowed lead wrist technique, notice as you bow it, it angles the club shaft slightly downwards. The club face is still more or less in line with the back of my lead hand. But what you can do to perform the motorcycle move that is used by Tyler Farrell, as you start bowing it, you also twist your fingers inwards a bit like that, you see, and that's called the twist away. That means the club face is more closed. So here I am at that position. I've closed the club face like Tyler Farrell demonstrates in his variation of the motorcycle move, and it's closed by an extra, say, 20-30 degrees relative to a golfer like Scotty Scheffler, who also uses a weak lead hand grip but does not use the bowed lead wrist technique combined with an element of twist away. So now let's see what will happen between now and impact. So as I'm coming down, I'm starting to release the club. The releasing club will eliminate the twist away component. See if I can stand further away. Maybe you could see the club. So at this point, the club face is still closed relative to the back of my lead hand. But as the club starts to release and stretches my finger flexor muscles in my lead forearm, the club face becomes in line with the bowed wrist. But, so here you're there. Notice, if you look at the club face, relative to the ball target line, it's open. And that is due to the fact that if you maintain a bowed lead wrist like this, it angles the club from this position to that position, right? So it's angled back like that. And the more you angle the club back, it opens the face, even if the face is continuously parallel to the back of your bowed lead wrist, like that. So now, to get into impact, I wouldn't want to come into impact like that because that's too much forward shaft lean. So let's say I desired only a small amount of forward shaft lean impact. So I have to, while requiring, keeping that bowed lead wrist more or less bowed by a similar amount. The only way that's possible, watch me, is I have to supinate it. So as you supinate your lead forearm, it allows you to come into impact with your desired amount of forward shaft lean. And you'll see if you look at, I'm putting my fingers on my radial bone, and you can see it's rotated to that position. If I didn't do that, if I did like Scotty Scheffler, same weak lead and grip, and came into impact with the same amount of forward shaft lean, stand further away, so Scotty Scheffler, stand at the forward shaft lean. Look where my radial bone's pointing. It's pointing a little bit to the right. But as I say, if you use the bowed lead wrist technique like that, and you come to impact with the same amount of desirable forward shaft lean, this radial bone has to be rotated more counterclockwise. So what I've demonstrated basically is that if you use the bowed lead wrist technique, you are going to have to supinate the lead forearm slightly more than if you didn't use the bowed lead wrist technique. And that's irrespective of whether you added a twist away maneuver like that, which closed the club face. Sorry, twist away with the lead hand. I was demonstrating the trail hand. So if you had a bit of twist away, that twist away dissipates as and by impact that's gone. So you're only left with a bowed lead wrist which angles the club shaft back. And to get the club face square and to get your desired amount of forward shaft lean, you have to supinate the lead forearm more. Now, the question is, if you have to supinate the lead forearm more, does it mean that this technique is less desirable than the standard technique, which I call the intact left forearm flying wedge technique and a geometrically flat left wrist technique? And the answer from my perspective is that it's actually a very desirable way to play golf. Let me explain why. So most professional golfers who use a weak or a neutral lead hand grip, as I've described, and who, like Scotty Scheffler, will do this motion. They'll come in, they'll square, release the club and square it, coming to impact like that. This motion. And they're going to use lead forearm supination to square the face. Now, when they come into impact, the way they create forward shaft lean. So if you, let's say, hit in a driver and you decide at impact you want your club shaft to be perpendicular to the ball target line, if that's like Scotty Scheffler tends to do. If you look at your radial bone and see its position, it's going to be more supinated. If you hit in an iron and you want to get more forward shaft lean with an iron, you'll notice your radial bone has to be angled slightly more to the right. So golfers who use this technique create forward shaft lean by varying the degree of rotation of the back of their hand during the late downswing, based on feel. Now, the advantage, I think, of the bowed lead wrist technique as used by John Rahm and Colin Morikawa is that if you bow it, you can start bowing it here, and you come to impact and it's bowed, you already have your desired amount of forward shaft lean. You might need more lead forearm supination to get exactly the desired amount of forward shaft lean, but it's inherent in this technique with the bowed lead wrist that it's leading the club and you've got forward shaft lead. The other thing is to do a bowed lead wrist technique, you have to be contracting your forearm muscles to maintain that bow. And I think that, I strongly suspect that when I look at John Rahm and Colin Morikawa going to impact like this, they seem to have a lot of mechanical stability with less tendency to flip and less tendency to roll. While if you perform a golf swing using what I call the standard technique, like this, it's very easy, if you lose your rhythm and you're not performing it with perfection, that if you stall your arm, your club might pass your arm and you flip like that. Or as you start supinating to square the face, you keep on supinating and roll it too much. And I think that if I had a choice, I would use the bowed lead wrist technique. I think it's very desirable because of these elements that I described. It inherently allows you to get forward shaft lean. It might require a little bit more forearm supination to square it, but that's easy to adjust to, and it feels so stable through impact. Now, why don't more professional golfers use this technique? I don't really know the answer to it, but I strongly suspect that it requires a level of flexibility in the lead wrist. When I try to do it, and I've tried to play golf that way, and I can't because my lead wrist doesn't want to be bowed. And to make it bowed, I have to really contract the muscles in my forearm. And I strongly suspect that certain golfers like John Rahm and Colin Morikawa have such hyper-flexible wrists that they can use the bowed lead wrist technique without tension in their forearm. But only a subset of professional golfers can do that, because I've noticed, I would say the majority of professional golfers who use a weak or a neutral lead hand grip use the standard technique as I demonstrated with Scotty Scheffler. So I hope this was instructive, and I'm going to now stop the recording.